All right, so we're going to talk about, I imagine this will kind of go in two different parts. We're going to talk about sensuality, libido, menopause, and I'd like to actually show you guys some images that might help like get in your mind where your organs are. I have this cool model, but I left it in Norway, this physical model that's really fun. I'm gonna have to order another one, I think, soon, just because it's really, really nice to see where everything is, so that, you know, we don't have a very good proprioception of, and proprioception is like when you close your eyes and you can feel where your hands are in space, right? Because you're just like, the neural pathways between your brain and your hand is really strong. But when you close your eyes, you can't really feel like where your uterus is in relationship to your ovaries, to your bladder, for example. Like, we don't have the proprioception built in our pelvises that way. That doesn't mean it's not possible. The original piece of what I think weaves through both of what you guys are here to learn about is kind of reconnecting. And that may be a brand new learning even. Well, I'll kind of weave that piece through, and then this postpartum conversation around what happens during pregnancy and after pregnancy to the pelvic floor and to the organs in the pelvis is really kind of interesting to know how the body naturally handles that, and also to understand like what could potentially, I don't want to say go wrong, but could not go right, depending on how we're supported and the kind of practices we're doing. So I do actually think that womb alignment is one of the threads that weave together. A lot of the symptoms that we have that you're both talking about have a lot to do with the position of the uterus, honestly. And there's all these different ways you can see in that second diagram. Particularly, there's like several ways the uterus can become misaligned. And this happens for a variety of reasons. Some of it's just as a product of like falling on your pelvis. Sometimes it's how the uterus shrinks back down after birth. If there's no like abdominal massage or vaginal steaming practice in place to help the body come back into alignment neutrally. It can happen if you're in any kind of, speaking of the way we hold tension, speaking of tension, if you're in any kind of like traumatic or emotionally stressing scenario, whether it's sexual or not, your body holds on to tension in different ways. Sometimes it's left and the right side of the pelvis hold differently. And so it just kind of creates a chronic situation over time. So this dynamic, or this diagram, shows how the uterus gets out of alignment in an anterior versus posterior position, but there's also left to right. And so I don't tell you this to freak you out and to set you on a trajectory of trying to figure out if your uterus is out of line, although you may have heard that from a gynecologist, and I did several times in pap smears and whatnot, because it is very common, but it's not a normal, natural way for your uterus to fit inside of your pelvis. And when it is in a misaligned position, it can, like in some of these diagrams, you can see it presses against the uterus, or it presses against the bladder, which can cause an aggravation of, all kinds of situations. Urge incontinence to stress incontinence, which are two different ways in which women leak. One of them has to do with there being a little too much tone in the pelvis, and therefore the pelvic floor musculature is weak and it's difficult for the sphincters to operate correctly. And one of them is because the pelvic floor musculature is too loose, and also there's a disconnect with the neural pathways and the firing of those sphincters. So I bring up uterine position. Pretend I'm a uterus. All right, here I am. cervix is down there. These are my fallopian tubes, right? If I am tilted like this, for example, this fallopian tube is hanging out in space, not connecting with an ovary. It's misaligned. Okay, so that can affect all kinds of things, including our fertility, but most importantly, what I want to mention here is how that ovary is responding to that pressure and that tension of being kind of squished and potentially not ovulating on that side. So when we're not ovulating, typically we ovulate left, right, back and forth. But when our uterus is tilted or squished over, or the ovaries are being misaligned and we're not ovulating on one side, that's half of the time that we're not getting progesterone and we're not getting our hormone cycle regulated by the natural expression of how the reproductive system should work with a normal and healthy aligned uterus. So that affects everything from postpartum depression to how we're experiencing our hormones and moods in perimenopause and menopause. So paying attention to uterine alignment, actually scratch that. You don't have to know where your uterus is. You can get to know by learning to sense and feel. You can actually do abdominal massage and get sensitive enough to be able to feel where it is. I've done the very first level of a technique of abdominal massage that teaches practitioners how to feel where the uterus is. I'm not at the point where I can diagnose where a woman's uterus is from the outside, but I can help her figure that out from a self-massage technique internally. You can tell a lot about where your uterus is by where your cervix is. So if you look at that diagram again, on the top one, it has a little arrow to where the cervix points. So when you have an anteversion, like your uterus is tilted too far forward and it's squishing the bladder, your cervix is poking your rectum behind. So or if a gynecologist were to insert fingers in to give you an exam, they would have a hard time feeling it. And so you can kind of tell by where your cervix is inside of your vaginal canal where your uterus is hanging out. And that's one practice that I highly recommend all women do on a regular basis. So understanding where your uterus is, we've covered that. That's a really good reason to do an internal, I call it vaginal mapping. So understanding where your uterus is by understanding where your cervix is. And so therefore you can do prescriptive self-massage techniques on the inside and on the outside through your belly and like into the pubic bone area. And I can show you guys a little bit more of that if you want. And then you can also do a fair amount of de-armoring, it's also called, by gently exploring the interior of your pelvis. And I have made a little like sort of a step-by-step ebook on how to do internal vaginal mapping, which I'll be happy to link to you guys. But the key thing is to take it really, really slowly and to not rush in a way that would cause you to further desensitize yourself. The whole point is to get more sensitive and to reconnect and to be nourishing and take care of your tissues. So you just want to be, it's like taking a psychedelic journey. You want to have set and setting. You want to be mindful of what's going on around you and what your internal state is. Another good reason to do this kind of practice is to help resensitize, and therefore not only for the sensation purpose, but sensuality is essentially, it's kind of a twofold conversation. We're talking about sensitization and being sensitive and having a sense of where our like home space is, right? Our womb, our core, our cervix. And if we can physically build that proprioception, then we're able to occupy that place mindfully. And that is, in essence, what I believe, if it were ever possible for human beings to exist without trauma. I know this is like a little bit of a fairy tale, but I paint this fairy tale for a purpose to help you understand what is innate in your body already. That there's not something wrong with you that you need to relearn. There's just layers of desensitization, of armoring that make that area not as easy to sense into and access. But if it were possible for human beings to never have had any pelvic or reproductive or sexual trauma or any hardship, then we would all be sensing into our uteruses and our cervixes just as much as we do into other parts of our body that we don't have physical contact with, like our lungs. We can feel our lungs, we can feel our hearts. Our uterus does a lot of work. We can sense into that area in a way that's not associated with pain, menstrual pain, birthing pain. And that capacity for sensitization and sensuality is innate. So the beauty of reconnecting with ourselves in that way is that we're just kind of coming back home to what's already there. The blueprint's already laid. So there's not necessarily a new thing that needs to be learned. These are practices that help you come home to who and what you already are. Does that make sense, that distinction? Cool. So when we are living in a life design, this is an interesting time to talk about all of this because we're being forced to slow way the fuck down in our lives right now, which is beautiful and also can be confronting, right? We're being confronted in a lot of different ways about our pace and the impact that has on our lives. And I think one of our greatest tools to sense into that is through sensuality, through our reproductive system, and through, the cycles in which we operate, our menstrual cycle, the greater cycle of going through menarche and then perimenopause and then menopause being a bigger cycle within that's the whole. So when we are making opportunities for ourselves to slow down and nourish and resensitize, then I typically see, regardless of the population I'm talking to, the symptoms of these different phases of our reproductive health tend to diminish. So whether we're talking about postpartum issues or we're talking about menopausal issues, the prescription's the same. In essence, it's taking time to resensitize and come back home. So yes, uterine position could have be part of that conversation. The stories that were told culturally about menopause being a time, actually, apparently when your reproductive system shuts down and it's normal that your libido goes away and that things just kind of slowly wither, is just that. It's just a cultural narrative. We have to work a little bit harder sometimes, and particularly if we're in long-term relationships, to keep things exciting. And what I mean by that is mostly for our own selves, because it is, although there are hormonal reasons that vaginal nectar would, like with the drop of progesterone and estrogen, that vaginal nectar would slow down. That doesn't necessarily mean that vaginal dryness and lack of libido are just what happens and that's it. the way that we tend to take care of ourselves can help our bodies bolster. And it's like a use it, if you don't use it, you lose it kind of situation. So these self-care practices that have to do with feeding and nourishing sensuality. I named a few: the internal mapping and abdominal massage. And I also feel pretty strongly about vaginal steaming for this. I mean, it's such a beautiful prep. So I'll give you a little bit of a quick little intro. So vaginal steaming is essentially sitting over a pot of herbs that have been slowly bubbling. So there's steam coming up, steam infused with plant essences. And the cool thing about this is that it's been documented in over 50 cultures around the world. It's really old, and people have been doing it for all kinds of reasons, women's health reasons particularly, and in every place that they've documented it, they've used it for postpartum care. So what it helps us do is partly along the same lines of resensitization and rekindling sensuality from the inside out. The steam builds our proprioception by giving us something to sense into. And it's a really beautiful, gentle, subtle experience to sense into. You are sitting over this. I'll show you what my setup looks like, actually. You're sitting over, these are little towels. Here's my box. The lid comes off. Inside, I have a little heating element and a little pot and a little bag of herbs. Okay, I've actually got it turned on because I'm gonna sit down on it when I'm done with this talk and chill the F out. It doubles as a stool. Isn't that handy? So you have this gentle sensation, all right? And that helps you find something that you can relax into and sense, and something that you can start to build proprioception with, right? But there are all these other magical things that happen when our genitalia is stimulated by a warm steam. First of all, the tissues down there are very highly mucosal, which means the steam actually can penetrate through cell walls and go all the way through into the pelvis, into the uterine tissues, into the ovaries, into the connective tissue that holds all of your organs in place, the musculature. So we can get into these states of feeling tense and then not know how the hell to release that tension. You know, we do these practices of internal vaginal mapping, and that is a really helpful way. So because you can feel with your own fingertips there, you can sense the tension. But this is actually just like it's like cheating. It's so much easier than setting yourself up and doing an internal session. So I actually do a vaginal steam every day almost, except for when you're bleeding. You shouldn't do it when you're bleeding. So there's this capacity to stimulate the nerves and to bring a bunch of blood flow. And then one of another magical things that's really wonderful for women who have had babies is it actually melts scar tissue. So if you've had any episiotomies, if you've ever had a cesarean or had any other pelvic type surgeries, or if you've ever had like polycystic ovarian syndrome or endometriosis and there's scar tissue in there that's making things less mobile, it helps to like melt. Sounds like too woo-woo or magical to believe, but there's a bunch of client testimonials and studies now from all over the world from the last couple of years, and we started documenting these things of women melting fibroids the size of my fist out of their bodies using just the simple active vaginal steaming. So it's incredibly helpful for hormone regulation in any stage of reproductive health, but particularly in menopause. And believe it or not, warm steam, if you're using herbs that are designed for cooling, can help with hot flashes and excess heat in the body, even though it's warm. So it's highly, highly useful for menopause. And the first university study on vaginal steaming was done in, I think 2019, maybe it's 2018, by two of my colleagues. And they found that across the board, Brooke, this is relevant to you, of all of the things they measured, which included fundal height, lochia, postpartum depression, scar tissue, weight loss, mood, couple other things that they were measuring. They basically had the test group, the folks that were doing vaginal steaming were where the control group was at 6 weeks, they were there in 8 days. So it really, 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 really helps postpartum. And essentially what it does, which is kind of crazy to fathom, but it stimulates the uterus in such a way that it almost activates a uterine cleanse. So this is obvious why a woman post-birth would want assistance with cleansing. But it's actually true that women, whether they've had babies or not, at any point, retain material in their uteruses. And sometimes, specifically when there's a uterine tilt going on in one way or another, and the uterus has to work really hard to get that material out. By the way, that's what causes menstrual cramps, is the uterus having to work really hard to get stagnant material out. It helps cleanse the material out of the uterus and lets the uterus slough fully for the next cycle. And so when there's material left at postpartum, it can create all kinds of problems. It's a major reason why women have fertility issues. Completely overlooked in the fertility conversation. And when there's material left over in the uterus from births 10 years ago, 15 years ago, from having a tilted uterus your whole life and not knowing it, from whatever reason, sometimes it just happens. There tends to be additional fluid that the body creates to sort of try to contain that. And so there's mucus, and then there's infection, and then there's yeast infections and bacterial infections, and that's where all of that stuff comes in. So that might be one of my favorite things about vaginal steaming, is this stimulation of a natural cleansing. And we've been told that the vagina it already cleanses itself naturally. Yes, it does, but it doesn't account for the stress of a modern lifestyle clamping down in our pelvises in a way that doesn't allow our uterus to be aligned and in the right position for gravity to help it empty. Does that make sense, you guys? That's a good question. Vaginal steaming prevents infection. The herbs, if they're formulated correctly, and that's why working with someone who has trained in vaginal steaming is really fucking important. Because you can create big trouble using the wrong herbs. But all of the herb blends that I use are naturally disinfecting, nourishing, cleansing, and some of them are specific for disinfection, and some of them are specific for stimulating uterus cleanses, and some of them are specific for cooling, and some of them are specific for gentle, more nourishing, like when a woman expresses periods that are 27 days or shorter, she needs more nourishment and less strong herbs. So we use the gentle blend. But if a woman is repeatedly having yeast infections, or bacterial vaginosis, then we use a disinfecting blend. So for women postpartum, the fact that you had a baby does not dictate what herb blend that you use. It's kind of, we're looking at the rest of the symptoms that you're experiencing and what was going on before you were pregnant and what you're experiencing now. So there'd be sort of a deeper conversation that we would have, but it is preventing infection. If if you help your body cleanse, and specifically if you have any stitches, like this is one thing that I saw in that study that blew my mind, is that it's so, I mean, I've never been pregnant, so I've never had this experience, but as a doula, I've seen it over and over and over in my clients, that they get so uncomfortable with the stitches afterwards. It's like fucking torture. And vaginal steaming helps keep them clean, keep them disinfected, and keeps the tissue soft and nourished, and helps it heal so much faster, so that it doesn't get to that itchy, really discomfort, scabby phase. So yeah, that is not an issue at all, the infection using vaginal steaming. It's actually a preventative measure. I recommend figuring out what you need for, like, what specific herbs, and I'm happy to do. I think what I'd like to do, honestly, this month, just because I want to take care of people, I want to do a free consultation for either of you if you're interested, to help you figure out what herbs, and I can provide you with the herbs and help you figure out how to do this on your own at home. But I showed you my my setup. It doesn't have to be this fancy thing. You could sit over 2 stools next to each other over a stock pot. But the protocol and the herb prescription is really important to get right, because you could do more harm than good. There's a lot of specific questions that I would ask to figure that out, which one would be best for you, depending on your symptoms. Statistics are staggering. It's like 60 to 70% of women. Age range is, I mean, I've been experiencing incontinence since I was in the middle of my 20s. I've never had children. It's a different kind of incontinence, but it still fucking sucks. So that's what it's called when you leak. So let's talk about pelvic floor musculature real quick. Wherever you're sitting, whatever you're sitting on, the layer of your pelvic floor musculature that's closest to what you're sitting on, that's layer 1, the most superficial layer. And that is a band of muscles that forms a figure 8 around your urethral sphincter and your vaginal sphincter, all right? And your anal sphincter. So it kind of makes this figure 8. And that gets stretched out or disrupted in its function for a variety of ways. Birth, for most people who are experiencing stress incontinence, is what does it. And episiotomies makes it worse. But for some of us who are chronic clenchers and leg squeezers and belly squeezers, and who just have a little more tension in the body than what maybe we ought to, maybe jaw tension, headaches, ringing in the ears, that stuff is usually related to too much tension in the pelvis as well. And both of those scenarios can cause that muscle group confusion, which is essentially part 1 of why we leak. Now, deeper in, there's, do you guys know where your sitting bones are? There's a group of muscles that swings between the 2 of them. And at the perineum, it meshes together with that first layer. So it's like a big chunk of muscle that's all together. That muscle group is layer 2. And then the third layer of the pelvic floor musculature, which is the closest to the uterus and to the bladder and to the rest of the organs, is this horseshoe-shaped group of muscles that kind of spans the entire interior of the pelvis, like so. So what people get wrong with treating incontinence in both cases, whether it's too much tone or not enough tone, is working with the superficial layers. We think that that's where the problem is. So they teach methods of kegeling, like stopping of stream of urine midstream. That's targeting the most superficial layer of your pelvic floor, but that's not going to solve the problem. We want to work at the deepest layer of the pelvic floor musculature, the third layer. this layer is the most difficult to sense and the most difficult to find because we have a general disconnection there for reasons I've already talked about in this conversation, but also because we've got big helper muscles, our glutes, that like to take the show. So whether you're dealing with the kind of incontinence that I have or the kind of incontinence that both of you are expressing after having children, you want to work with that third layer, either way. And the way that you work with it is different, but in both cases, you need to learn to relax and breathe and find that responsiveness first. That's why I love vaginal steaming. That's why I love internal remapping and re-sensitization and abdominal massage and just kind of like getting the pliability and the responsiveness of these muscles back online first. Now, once that's the case, then you can do some very specific targeted strengthening. And what I prefer to do is have women work with me individually, so that, because it's such a nuanced, and Brooke, you said this, like, I don't even know where I would begin to try to engage these muscles, and it takes time to find them again. And it's really tempting to go do a bunch of crunches, but that's not where you want to start. So since those muscles are so nuanced and difficult to find inside of the pelvis, I often work with synergistic muscle groups, the muscle groups that help you fire your pelvic floor. And those are on either side. It's sort of like your pelvic floor is here. Below your pelvic floor, you've got your inner thigh muscles or your adductors. And then above your pelvic floor, you have your deepest core muscle. The deepest one, so we've got 4 layers of core. And the transverse abdominis is the deepest core muscle. That group of muscles helps you find your pelvic floor. And when you work with all 3 of them together, you can train your pelvic floor muscles to fire without having to specifically have the neural pathways in place to fire them independently. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right, so there's some specific core type exercises that I help women work with in conjunction with deep breathing techniques that help them release and then fire mindfully. And the exciting thing is it doesn't take long when you're doing the right thing in the right way to turn these muscles back on. It's not like you need to pump iron and do kegels endlessly all day long. That is not the function of those muscles. However, they are like the bottom of your grocery bag. They have to be able to hold the rest of your organs up. And this is what happens, unfortunately, when, later in life, women don't do anything about their symptoms and the organs start to prolapse. So we're talking in this conversation now in hopes that that doesn't happen and that we do a little bit of simple preventative daily maintenance. It's like brushing your teeth now to prevent having those worst case scenarios later in life. And you think incontinence is bad. Imagine having your uterus coming out of your body. Hopefully that hasn't happened to either of you, but that fucking sucks. And even then, we can fix that. And I've done this work with women. Unless there's someone who knows how to help you feel what the right muscles are, with their fingers inserted into your vagina, and you're relaxed, and you are trying to press where their fingers are, you're not going to find the muscles you need to create a Kegel in a way that's going to help you. But I am saying they're a very, very nuanced tool that we're not being taught to use correctly. And like I said earlier, if you're not using those muscles correctly, you're grabbing your glutes, you're grabbing the most superficial muscles you can find, and it's just clench everything. Well, part of that conversation is this, oh, how do I say this? We've also been conditioned that tight pussy equals good. It's not. A tight pussy is one that is experiencing pain and tension and all kinds of dysfunction. And like kegels were designed to make a tighter pussy and designed by men. I don't want to get on a whole patriarchal rant about it really, because it's just not, it's not a very helpful exercise unless you're, like I said, being very mindful about it. And also there is a natural, what happens to our tissues over time as we age and as progesterone leaves our body, and we are facing, like, what happened from the magic of creating children out of your body is that bone density may have been depleted. Your elasticity inside of the pelvis may have been affected. There might be scar tissue, and your connective tissue might be like a little bit more, have some residual tension or be a little bit stiffer. And those all contribute to that incontinence part, which the like practices that I've been talking about directly focus on, reinvigorating and reviving those tissues by an inside out prescription. But there is the aging process happens, and we are sort of facing an uphill battle as we get older, and more time, things that just used to happen for you may just not happen automatically anymore. And so establishing these practices of self-care, if remaining sexually viable later in life, and having a uterus that senses and feels, and having connection to your core and creativity in that way, or having a bladder that doesn't leak, those things are important to you, then, you know, it's just like if you want to continue to run later in your years, you're going to do some extra training, where you used to maybe when you're in your 20s could just go run 10 miles off the couch. That's just not how it is as we age, and as specifically as menstruation slows down. I just want to preface that the female orgasm is so complicated. There are so many pieces to this conversation. So I'll just talk about, I think your correct question was directly what we're talking about, how that could affect orgasm, right? Because there's like all these other, again, it's like taking psychedelics. Set and setting have a lot to do with how open and receptive our bodies are, how safe we're feeling, what kind of relationship and where we're at in our relationship, and etc. But speaking about physical location of the uterus, for example, physical location of the cervix, for example, the like receptiveness and suppleness and tone of the musculature, and the energetic holding going on in the organs, all of that, which is affected by vaginal steaming, internal de-armoring or vaginal mapping, and abdominal massage. All of those tools help us resensitize, reconnect with innate sensuality and responsiveness of tissues. And all of that is beneficial for us to be able to feel at home inside of our bodies. When we have you ever, either of you ever had like a yeast infection or bacterial vaginosis, or any like thing going on down there that was kind of like, whoa, funky? Did you also notice how like it was more than just like having an infection on your finger? There was like a deeper sense of disruption going on in your system, like almost a psycho-spiritual disruption. Like there's a really cool book, I think it's called Vagina, talking about the pussy brain connection and about how we are, we're really emotionally and otherwise affected by what's going on in the state of our pelvis and our vagina and how we're doing in our relationship to our sexuality. And orgasm is in that category. And I don't even need to mention the societal / cultural expectation on women to orgasm. So, yes, having more blood flow and having your uterus in a healthy position helps you have and resensitize vaginal canal, helps you have like more readily available orgasms, but it also helps you have. Did you know you could have orgasms from clitoral stimulation? Yes, that we understand. But did you also know you can have cervical orgasms and womb orgasms? These kinds of orgasms that are originating deeper in our bodies, that are less superficial, are available when we're essentially more available when we're essentially de-arming, when we're not holding so much tension that we are not responsive in those tissues. So when we do these practices and open up and soften and become literate within our own bodies, we're understanding our own body literacy, and therefore kind of like reconnecting with what makes us feel good and how we like to be touched. Then those deeper states of safety, feeling safe and accessing pleasure inside of us becomes available. A lot of that is just because things are shut down due to desensitization, and that has to do with a variety of things. We tend to hold ourselves when we're in stressful situations, and so I've been doing this. I'll give you an example. I've been doing this kind of internal resensitization work for continuously for the last 15 years. All right, so I can most days slow down, sit on my steam box and feel my cervix. But if I leave the house and a deer jumps out in front of my car and I have a crazy like gut response and adrenaline and I slam on the brakes and I feel for my life, it's like my pelvis jams up and becomes tense. It's just a really familiar pattern in my musculature and in my system. And I think that's very true for most of us. And that is, I guess for me, and probably this is for most women, I won't speak, I don't know your pelvis histories, but for most of us, our relationship with our with pleasure and with being touched has been not necessarily on our own terms. Being touched by gynecologists, being touched by awkward boys on the sort of PG side of the spectrum as far as uncomfortable touch goes, and then like all the way to trauma and rape and like abuse. Most women on this planet have experienced somewhere in that spectrum of not okay touch, more often than not. And so when we start to look towards this direction of, all right, I want to have more sensitivity and I want to experience more pleasure and I want to stop having these dysfunctions in my reproductive cycles, however they may be, whatever issue we're talking about here, then we're also going to unearth some of these experiences in our tissues that may be a little bit uncomfortable. So there is a curve that you may see that, sitting on the steam box, I often just am with the client quietly holding space as they cry, because there's a re-imprinting of the tissues that happens in a way that's really fucking profound. Being touched in that way with the steam just gently, nourishingly creating a resensitization is almost like wiping the slate clean of all of these unpreferred touches that happened. And that can be a little bit intense and confronting. I'm just going to say that. But once you're kind of through, then the natural state of being is pleasure. So you don't have to do anything to get to have good orgasms. It's almost like not doing all the shit we've learned to do, like hold tension in our pelvis. When we have to go pee, we don't go pee, we hold it for a while. And simple things like that can just create layers of tension and layers of disassociation. Not saying the thing when we really want to say the thing because we're afraid of being disliked, that kind of stuff. So when it's confronting to start looking at how we put ourselves into boxes, try to please our partners, use our sexuality as a way to get safe, as a way to, we unconsciously have been taught to use it as currency instead of a self-expression. And so when we're doing that unconsciously, reaching for orgasms because A, we think we should be orgasmic, B, we want our partner to feel like a good lover, those are going to be the wrong reasons. And therefore, if you're not orgasming, that's intelligent. Well, I guess most specifically, I can tell you, like I experienced trespass at age 5 and age 11. And I learned that my sexuality and my vagina were not mine. And then I guess something in there was wired funny, where I was also afraid in those scenarios. So seeking safety meant offering myself sexually. So I was in this pattern for most of my high school and into my 20s where I was promiscuous to feel belonging and to feel valid and validated. And I used my body to get that feeling of safety. And that was just it. That was how it worked. And it wasn't until the last 5 to 8 years I started really noticing that and inspecting that and starting to unpack that for myself has been very, very confronting, honestly. I still find myself thinking and acting out narratives of like, well, if my husband and I aren't having sex enough, then something's wrong here. I don't want to be in a sexless marriage. Like, though there's so many bad sitcoms and like, we're just like fucking inundated with our value having to be related to sexuality in some way. So all of that doing that kind of thing with my sexuality was just a different direction. So I didn't have to relearn how to be sensual, but what I had to do was stop doing that and then come back to baseline and be like, wow, I don't know what touch I like. I don't know how, like what dynamics make me feel turned on. I don't know what fantasies. I don't like. It was so interesting to me to be like, whoa. And I think that the exploration of what we're unpacking when we're working with the tissues that we're exploring in this conversation, to understand that there's this other conversation happening inside of ourselves around what our sexuality is to us, what pleasure is to us, what orgasm means to us. It is not necessarily a end goal for sexual exploration. Each time each person engages sexually with another person, it has to end in orgasm. Not true at all. There's so much more pleasure and exploration to be had when there's not that goal, that singular goal, or that defining badge that you get at the end that makes you, get your thumbs up or whatever. Sometimes I've even had more fun and more enjoyment and more fulfillment with my partner when neither one of us orgasm. And I know that that's like not rocket science, but just having permission and just saying it out loud feels good. And it felt good to me when I heard it. What I love about approaching sensuality the most and sexuality the most is because when we can find self-mastery here, not just with our physical body and like ownership and occupy our physical tissues, but the greater conversation that we've been looking at, then we're resilient in crisis. No disassociation with our core and with our power and with where we originate our sense of belonging from. For me, like it's kind of a conversation around the deepest spirituality of non-dualism, where we're not creating this schism between us and other. You know, sexuality maybe isn't the first thing on your mind right now, but this conversation is the same as taking care of yourself, making sure that you are resourced for your children and for your partner, for the greater community. But it's got to be, it's like in the order of priorities in moments like these. It's got to be you, your immediate others, and then your community. You have to double down on taking care of yourself when we're under so much stress and tension. And it's not selfish. And it's really fucking hard for new moms to do that. And the reason why it's so hard is because we're fucking so isolated. We're not in a community. We don't need to meet in person. We can meet in person in Zoom, one-on-one this way. And because really, like, aside from like the hands-on work, which I would love to do, I can tell you how to do it all for yourself or how to coach your partner. That's also very valuable. I'm going to give you a quick tutorial on how to do internal self massage. Okay. So you want to not have long fingernails. You want to have really clean hands. You can even use gloves if you want. I like to do this in the shower where I squat down. And if your vagina, I use a piece of art since I made one recently. This is your clitoris. This is your anus down here. All right. So this is noon and this is 6 p.m. Right? It's like a clock. So you don't want to fool around too much where the tubing is at noon and at 6. Right? So we've got the urinary sphincter up at noon and then your rectum down at 6. There's generally like, oh, it just doesn't feel good. But all the way around the sides is where you can work. To just, so like this whole area, you insert either a thumb and you work the opposite side, like so, or 2 fingers or 1 finger. Everybody's angles is different. I like to squat down and use my thumb personally. It's nice in a squat because everything's close. Everything's kind of, gravity's taking things down, but that can be uncomfortable. So in that case, if you get into the shower and it feels uncomfortable, then you can do it in bed lying back to take some pressure off. In that case, you'll definitely want to have some lubrication. I prefer water-based lubes. If you're going to use an oil, don't use coconut oil. Everybody thinks coconut oil is a good lube. It's not. It gets hard and doesn't absorb. It's cold when it's cold. Granted, it's in your body, so it's going to be at least room temperature and will be more viscous, but it's a thick oil that's difficult to absorb into your body. So you want to use something that's lighter, like grapeseed oil is a really great oil, or almond oil or avocado oil as a lubricant if you don't have water-based lube. There's the first part of where you're just mapping out and noticing as you feel around and sort of massage if there's any tension anywhere. You may come inside and be like, whoa, that hurts already. And then you just be with that and you breathe and you take some time there and you just don't have an agenda. And you're kind of, working the left and the right side along the wings. And what you do when you insert your fingers in there, you'll notice that you go through layer 1, through layer 2, and then through layer 3. And there's almost like here's your vaginal canal, and this is your pelvic bone. You kind of go on the inside of the bone. You're massaging layer 3 from the inside on each side. Or here I'm using my thumb. So that's one thing to explore with your internal massage. The second thing to explore is to find your cervix. It's really cool. It actually feels like touching the tip of your nose. Yeah, it's a little bit cartilagey, except that there's a hole in the center. There's not a hole in the center of your nose. It's sort of like a soft donut, but that's a sensation. And the cool thing about that is, like, do you notice when you touch your nose, you're feeling the sensation in your finger and your nose at the same exact time? Mm-hmm. Your brain is compensating for the distance that this synapse has to travel. And the work it takes to do that builds proprioception. It builds sensitization. It helps you connect that part of your body. So being with your cervix in that way, that's way down there. Your finger is way down there. So your brain's like bing, 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 bing. And it's really cool to do this with your own sensey things. Mm-hmm. Some people teach it with wands because sometimes it's a little bit far up there to find your cervix. But I say make the effort and reach, because you get twice as much nervous system reconnection by using your own hand. So when you find your cervix, you can be like, wow, what an amazing organ. What does it feel like to breathe into that? Can I go around it? Is there anything to sense into? You may notice, don't freak out, but you may notice cysts on your cervix. You may notice bumps. Totally normal. Steaming gets rid of them. Self-massage gets rid of them. They just don't freak out if you find anything super crazy in there. And if you do, call me. And believe me, it might take 2, 3, 4, 6, 10 different attempts until it doesn't feel clinical. So just be with, okay, I'm doing this, feels a little bit robotic. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to say is frequency. I don't know. They're really, as long as you're not currently bleeding, there's no reason why you can't. If you're gentle with yourself, explore like this every day. If you did it once or twice a week, that would be above and beyond. But just for the purpose, depends on what your purposes are. You guys might be full.